Dear friends, welcome to our channel. We are very happy to share with you different stories about love and betrayal from around the world. So let's begin our story journey today. The sound of champagne glasses clinking echoed throughout the banquet hall, with elegant silhouettes moving beneath crystal chandeliers. This was the celebration of Michael and Susan's 25th wedding anniversary, and almost all of Oak Ridge community's notable figures had come. Dr. Michael had earned a modest reputation locally. His family medical clinic had served the community for nearly 20 years, while his wife Susan was an active figure in social circles, known for her participation in charitable activities. Susan stood in the center of the banquet hall, a champagne-colored evening gown accentuating her elegant demeanor. She gently tapped her glass to get the guests' attention, wearing a smile that was difficult to interpret. First, thank you all for coming to our wedding anniversary celebration. Susan looked around, her voice slightly trembling but full of enthusiasm. For 25 years, Michael has been a reliable husband and father, but tonight, I have a special announcement. She raised her champagne glass, with excitement sparkling in her eyes. After tonight, tomorrow I will be going to Hawaii with the love of my life. The guests applauded and cheered, thinking this was a blessing for the busy doctor couple. Michael stood to the side, his face filled with confusion. He searched his memory, not recalling such an arrangement, but still maintained a professional smile. "What time do we leave?" he asked, approaching Susan quietly. Just then, their 20-year-old daughter Emily interrupted. "Dad, don't you know? Because you're simply not the love of her life. Stay home and watch the house." Emily's tone carried a strange pride, as if she had known the inside story all along. The atmosphere in the banquet hall instantly froze. Guests looked at each other, whispers beginning to rise. Michael's face tensed, a flash of shock crossing his eyes, but he quickly calmed down. He put down his glass, took a deep breath, and looked directly at Susan. "Love of your life." Michael's voice was surprisingly calm. "I'm glad you found him. However, you might need to inform Robert that his Helping Poor Children project will receive a full audit notice from the tax office and charity regulatory agency next week. This afternoon, I just submitted an anonymous but detailed report entitled Concerns about Misuse of Donations, attaching all the suspicious financial flows from the past 2 years. Those flows that, coincidentally, perfectly match your frequent business trips to vacation destinations." Robert, Susan's charity project partner, standing in the corner, almost dropped his glass. His face changed from shock to anger, finally settling on a kind of indescribable fear. Susan seemed fixed to the spot, her lips trembling slightly, but saying nothing. The guests' whispers turned into obvious discomfort. Some began to quietly leave, while others stayed, anticipating more dramatic scenes. Susan finally found her voice. "Michael, what nonsense are you talking about?" She tried to cover it with a laugh, but that smile was sadder than crying. "This is just a normal vacation." "Save it, Susan," Michael interrupted her, his voice still calm. "I have evidence enough to get Robert's charity organization into serious trouble, and enough to destroy the social image you've so carefully cultivated." He turned to Emily, with both disappointment and a certain relief in his eyes. "And you, Emily, have obviously chosen sides. Good. This will make the coming things simpler." Emily's smug expression began to crumble. She seemed to only now realize what her father's words meant. "Dad, you won't really. Divorce papers will be delivered to your mother tomorrow," Michael said calmly. "As for her travel plans with Robert, I think they'll need to be rescheduled. After all, dealing with tax investigations and legal proceedings will take up a lot of time." With that, Michael turned and walked toward the exit. No shouting, no glass smashing, just a wounded but still dignified man leaving the celebration he had organized. Michael and Susan's marriage had once been a model in the Oak Ridge community. They met in medical school, where Susan was studying nursing and Michael was specializing in family medicine. After graduation, they settled in this quiet suburb. Michael opened his own clinic, while Susan chose to pause her career after giving birth to Emily to focus on the family. As Emily grew up, Susan began to feel her life lacked purpose. 10 years ago, when Emily entered high school, Susan joined a local nonprofit organization focused on children's welfare, trying to redefine herself. There, she met Robert, a charismatic nonprofit organization leader. Robert was 2 years older than her, had experienced a failed marriage, but his manner of speaking and passion for charity left a deep impression on Susan. Initially, Susan viewed Robert only as an important partner in the charity circle. She used her status as a doctor's wife and her social network to raise funds for Robert's organization. Michael fully supported his wife's new career, not only frequently attending fundraising events, but also donating generously. At that time, he felt relieved that his wife had regained enthusiasm for life. However, as time passed, the relationship between Susan and Robert underwent a subtle change. Robert always listened to Susan's ideas and aspirations, praising her social abilities and not just seeing her as the doctor's wife. He gave her a type of recognition and appreciation that Michael couldn't provide. "You have extraordinary talent in charity work, Susan," Robert once told her after a dinner. "You deserve more recognition." This attention gradually evolved into an emotional dependency, and finally, during an organization field observation trip, developed into a physical relationship. For Susan, this wasn't just a physical betrayal, but a rebellion against the status quo. What she craved wasn't just the excitement of an affair, but a way to redefine herself. Meanwhile, Emily was also gradually attracted by her mother's radiance in the social circle. The charitable activities Susan participated in frequently appeared on local news, and her status in the community kept rising. In comparison, although Michael was a respected doctor, his low-key style and focus on work seemed mundane and unremarkable in Emily's eyes. "Mom, your speech today was amazing," Emily once excitedly said after a charity dinner. "Everyone was listening to you, like you were some kind of star." Susan enjoyed her daughter's admiration, which further reinforced her pursuit of a new identity. Emily began to participate more in her mother's social activities and less in her father's life. For Michael, although this distance was painful, he understood that teenagers need to find their own path. He continued to support Susan's charity work while maintaining his dedication to the clinic. The turning point occurred on a Wednesday afternoon 8 months ago. That day, Michael finished work at the clinic earlier, wanting to surprise Susan. Their wedding anniversary was approaching, and he planned to invite her to a newly opened restaurant. When he arrived home, he found the house empty, with no sign of Susan. This was not unusual. Susan frequently participated in various community activities. Michael was about to text her when the house landline rang. He answered, and the male voice on the other end clearly mistook him for Susan. "Hey darling, I upgraded the accommodation in Maldives. It cost a bit more, but you'll love it. Also, don't forget about the speech at next week's fundraiser. We need to make sure the donors are moved by your story." Michael didn't immediately reveal his identity, but softly acknowledged. The person on the other end continued, "Oh, and don't forget to tell Michael the weekend event was canceled, so you don't have to make up excuses. Love you, see you later." After hanging up, Michael stood in the middle of the kitchen, experiencing a strange calmness. He could have immediately confronted Susan, but his professional training as a doctor had taught him to gather sufficient information before making a judgment. He began to notice details from the past few months that he had ignored. Susan's increasingly frequent charity trips, her large withdrawals from the family's joint accounts, the frequency with which she appeared with Robert in social media photos. Michael used his professional network to find a friend who worked in the charity sector, discreetly inquiring about Robert's organization. The friend's response was vague but hinted at some financial issues, which further raised Michael's suspicions. As the family's main financial provider, Michael had the right to review all joint account records. He began systematically organizing the data and discovered a disturbing pattern. Each of Susan and Robert's charity trips corresponded with large withdrawals, and the destinations were often luxury resorts rather than places where actual charity projects were located. Before confirming his suspicions, Michael hired a private investigator. As a doctor, he well knew that solid evidence is needed before making major decisions. The investigator's report confirmed his worst assumptions. Susan and Robert were not merely professional partners, but lovers, and this relationship had lasted for nearly 2 years. What shocked Michael more was that the investigation also uncovered serious financial irregularities in Robert's organization. Large amounts of donations were not used for the publicly advertised children's welfare projects, but were diverted for personal expenses or invested in dubious investments. Susan was clearly aware, and even helping Robert use her social reputation to attract more donors. Faced with all this, Michael didn't immediately explode. He began carefully collecting evidence, contacting legal advisors to understand divorce procedures. At the same time, he compiled a detailed report on the financial problems of Robert's organization, including all suspicious fund flows and expenditures inconsistent with charitable activities. During this process, Michael maintained an appearance of calm. He continued working, attending community events, and even participating in several fundraising dinners organized by Susan. No one could detect any anomalies in his expression, and Susan and Robert, immersed in the carefully constructed double life, had no idea a storm was approaching. With the 25th wedding anniversary approaching, Michael decided to reveal the truth on this symbolic day. He anonymously submitted a report about Robert's organization to relevant regulatory authorities while preparing divorce documents. He knew this would unleash a storm, but he believed it was necessary, not only for his dignity, but also for the donors who had been deceived. The night after the wedding anniversary celebration, Michael stood in front of the window of his newly rented apartment, looking at the city lights. He felt a strange liberation, as if a long-standing weight on his chest had finally been lifted. A 25-year marriage ending in this way should have made him feel pain and anger, but at this moment, he only had a serene determination. His phone constantly vibrated, displaying missed calls and messages from Susan, Emily, and even Robert. He didn't respond to any of them. Instead, he poured himself a glass of whiskey and quietly contemplated his future path. The next morning, when the divorce papers arrived at the house, Susan was anxiously pacing in the living room. Her eyes were swollen, evidently having not slept all night. Upon seeing the documents, she immediately called Michael, but could only hear the voicemail tone. "Michael, we need to talk." She left a message, her voice mixed with anger and fear. "You can't just make decisions like this. I know you're angry, but this is a 25-year marriage. We should at least communicate face to face." Michael didn't reply. He had decided to handle all communications through lawyers. The divorce terms he proposed were relatively fair. Susan could keep the family home, but he would retain the clinic and most personal assets. Considering that Emily was already an adult, there were no custody issues to deal with. Meanwhile, Robert's organization faced severe challenges. The tax office and charity regulatory agencies began a thorough investigation, carefully examining all financial records. Local media got wind of it and began reporting on this potential charity fraud case. Although initial reports didn't directly name Susan, people in the community quickly associated her with this scandal. "We need to coordinate our response strategy," Robert told Susan during a private meeting, with a tone of panic. "If we maintain a unified story, perhaps we can salvage something." Susan looked at him coldly. "Salvage what, Robert? The tax records and bank statements are all there. This isn't something that can be covered up with a story. Have you forgotten that you're also involved?" Robert countered, a dangerous gleam in his eyes. "You knew where the money was going. You enjoyed those luxurious vacations with me. If I fall, you won't come out unscathed." This silenced Susan. She was indeed involved. Although initially she might not have known, over time she had clearly become aware of the organization's financial problems. She didn't expose them because that would mean ending her relationship with Robert and losing everything she had built in her social circle. Meanwhile, Emily tried to contact her father, but Michael maintained the same distance. "Dad, please, at least talk to me," Emily pleaded in a voice message. "I know I said terrible things, but at that time I didn't understand the seriousness of the situation." 2 weeks later, Michael finally agreed to meet with his daughter, choosing a neutral cafe. Emily almost broke down upon seeing her father. "Dad, I'm really sorry," she sobbed. "I didn't know things between Mom and Robert were so serious. I thought it was just—" She paused, as if searching for the right words. "You thought it was just a common affair?" Michael calmly completed. "Even then, do you think that would be acceptable?" Emily lowered her head. "I just thought Mom seemed so happy and vibrant in those charity activities. And you were always working at the clinic. I worked to support the family, including your mother's so-called charity work." Michael's voice had a touch of bitterness. "But that's not the key point. The point is deception and betrayal, Emily. Not just betrayal towards me, but towards the donors who trusted them." Emily was silent for a moment. "So you'll never forgive Mom?" Michael looked directly into his daughter's eyes. Some betrayals are too deep to forgive. This isn't just about emotions, but about values and integrity. I can understand human weakness, but I cannot accept continuous deception and the desecration of trust. This conversation didn't resolve all the issues, but it was at least a start. Emily began to understand her father's position. Though she still loved her mother, she also realized the severity of the situation. Meanwhile, the investigation into Robert's organization deepened. Auditors discovered that over the past 5 years, more than $1 million in donations had been diverted for personal expenses or had gone to unknown accounts. The local newspaper published a series of investigative reports detailing how this charity scam operated. Susan's social status rapidly collapsed. Those friends who once surrounded her began to distance themselves, and invitations to social events drastically decreased. Worse still, some former donors began to publicly question her integrity, demanding explanations about the destination of the donations. Under this pressure, Susan attempted to communicate with Michael again. "Michael, I know you don't want to see me," she wrote in an email. "But there are things I need to explain to you in person. Not to salvage anything, just to let you know the truth." Michael considered it for several days, finally agreeing to meet. He chose a public place, a quiet restaurant, on a weekday afternoon. When Susan arrived, he was already waiting. Susan looked much more haggard, her former radiance no longer present. She sat down, hands firmly clasped together, evidently nervous. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," she began, her voice lower than usual. "I know nothing can change what has already happened, but I wanted you to know the whole truth." Michael nodded, not speaking, waiting for her to continue. "My relationship with Robert began only as a working partnership. He appreciated my social skills and valued my ideas. Over time, I began to depend on this recognition. At home, I always felt like the doctor's wife, but in the charity circle, I had my own identity." "I never made you feel you were just the doctor's wife," Michael interrupted. "I always supported every one of your decisions, including your dedication to charity work." "I know." Susan looked at her hands. "This was my problem, not yours. I craved more attention and recognition, and Robert gave me those. But I never thought things would go this far." "And the misappropriated donations?" Michael asked directly. "Will you also say that happened accidentally?" Susan was silent for a moment. "At first I didn't know. When I found out, things had already been going on for a while, and I was already too deeply involved. Exposing it meant ending everything, including the social image I had built. I chose to remain silent. That was my biggest mistake." Michael looked at his once wife, feeling both sadness and strangeness. "You know, Susan, if it had just been infidelity, perhaps with time I could have understood, even forgiven. But you participated in deceiving those good people, using their kindness to satisfy your own vanity. That is what I cannot accept." "I understand." Susan's voice was almost a whisper. "I'm not seeking forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that, whatever the outcome, I will accept responsibility." Leaving the restaurant, Michael felt a strange release. This conversation didn't change anything, but it at least provided some kind of closure. He had decided to look forward, rebuild his life, without needing to forgive or forget the past betrayal. The divorce process turned out to be more complicated than expected. Although the conditions proposed by Michael were relatively fair, details related to asset division still required much negotiation. He maintained professional coolness, handling most communications through lawyers, avoiding direct contact with Susan. Meanwhile, the investigation into Robert's organization continued to deepen. The prosecutor's office began considering bringing criminal charges against him, including fraud, embezzlement, and tax irregularities. Susan, as a senior advisor to the organization, also faced legal risks, though to a lesser degree. In the community, discussion about this charity scam continued to ferment. Some people expressed sympathy towards Michael, considering him a victim of this incident. But there were also those who questioned why he hadn't exposed this problem earlier, and even some speculated that he might have been aware but chose silence until problems arose in the marriage. "People always like to gossip," a colleague of Michael commented during lunch. "Don't pay too much attention to those rumors." Michael just shrugged. "I've never cared what others think. I know what I did and why I did it." Indeed, these rumors did affect some of his patients. Some long-term patients quietly switched to other clinics, but more people chose to continue trusting this doctor they had known for years. Emily found herself in an awkward position during her parents' divorce. On one hand, she felt disappointed and angry about her mother's behavior. On the other hand, she couldn't completely cut off emotional ties with her. She frequently went back and forth between her parents, trying to understand and reconcile, though she knew reconciliation was no longer possible. "Dad, have you thought about starting over?" Emily carefully asked one night, during dinner at Michael's new apartment. Michael put down his cutlery, thinking for a moment. "If you mean a new relationship, the answer is no. At least not now. If you mean life, then yes, I am already starting over. Mom is very regretful, you know," Emily said softly. "She's lost almost all her friends. She's doing volunteer work at the community center, trying to—" "Emily," Michael gently interrupted her, "I understand your desire to reconcile your parents, but some things, once they happen, cannot be recovered. Your mother's so-called regret is more about the consequences than the act itself. If she hadn't been discovered, she would have continued with that lifestyle." Emily didn't argue, because she knew what her father said was probably true. She had witnessed her mother's radiance and confidence in the charity circle and now saw her downfall and loneliness. The change was so great that she sometimes doubted whether she really knew her mother. The divorce was finally finalized 6 months later, just in time for the beginning of autumn. According to the agreement, Susan kept the family home but had to pay compensation to Michael, considering his contribution to the property. Michael retained the clinic and most investments, which allowed him to maintain a relatively comfortable lifestyle. The day they signed the final documents, Michael and Susan briefly met at the lawyer's office. Susan looked more haggard than the last time they met, with marked dark circles under her eyes. "The documents are ready," said the lawyer. "You just need to sign in the marked places." They silently signed all the documents. When the lawyer left the room to make copies, Susan finally spoke. "So this ends it?" Michael nodded. "Yes, legally it ends." "Do you hate me?" Susan suddenly asked, with certain vulnerability in her voice. Michael reflected for a moment. "Hate is too intense an emotion. It requires continuous attention and energy." "I don't hate you, Susan. I just feel disappointed and strange towards you. 25 years of marriage, I thought I knew you, but obviously I didn't know you. Perhaps I never knew myself," Susan said softly. "Until now that I've lost everything, I begin to understand." Michael didn't respond to this half self-pitying, half regretful statement. For him, this conversation was just a formality, a necessary procedure, not a real exchange or reconciliation. After leaving the lawyer's office, Michael drove to his clinic. Work had always been his refuge, where he could temporarily forget the chaos of his personal life and focus on helping others. Meanwhile, Robert's legal troubles kept deepening. The prosecutor's office formally filed criminal charges against him, including multiple counts of fraud and financial irregularities. During the trial, more details were disclosed, including how large amounts of donations were used for private travel, luxury gifts, and dubious investments. Susan attended the trial as a witness, as part of an agreement with the prosecution in exchange for a lighter sentence. On the witness stand, she had to describe in detail her level of involvement, including how she knew of the misuse of funds but chose to remain silent. This process was undoubtedly painful for her, but also inevitable. "How did the defendant Robert explain these fund flows to you?" asked the prosecutor. Susan took a deep breath. "He said they were necessary operating costs, used to maintain key relationships and expand the organization's influence. At first I believed him, but over time, I gradually realized that most of the money was being spent on personal enjoyments." "After realizing this, what actions did you take?" Susan lowered her head. "I took no action. I chose to remain silent." "Why?" "Because exposing him meant ending our relationship and also meant ending everything I had built in the community. I chose personal interest over integrity." This testimony not only had a decisive impact on Robert's case, but also further damaged Susan's image in the public eye. She was no longer just a deceived woman, but an accomplice who knew of improper conduct but chose to participate. The court finally found Robert guilty, sentencing him to 4 years in prison and hefty fines. As part of the agreement, Susan avoided imprisonment but received 2 years of probation and community service. More importantly, she had to return a large amount of personal gains, which forced her to sell the house to pay these costs. When the sentence was announced, Robert's look towards Susan was full of resentment and betrayal. In his view, she had chosen to protect herself by sacrificing him. And Susan, standing before reporters outside the court, appeared exceptionally calm. "I take full responsibility for my actions," she told the media. "My choices hurt many people, including the donors who trusted us and my family. I accept the court's judgment and will do my best to remedy these mistakes." Although these words sounded sincere, Michael, seeing the news report, only felt a distancing. He no longer recognized that woman on television. She had become a stranger. Meanwhile, Emily, after graduating from university, chose medical school, partly influenced by her father. She began to understand the value and meaning of the medical profession, no longer just seeing the shiny surface and social recognition. "I understand why you chose this path, Dad," she said during a family dinner. "This isn't just a job, but a service and responsibility." Michael felt pleased by his daughter's growth, though this growth came from painful experiences. "Every profession has its value, Emily," he said. "What's important is why you choose it and how you fulfill its responsibilities." After completing his sentence, Robert found that he could hardly reintegrate into society. His reputation was completely destroyed, and most of his assets had been lost due to compensations and fines. He tried to contact Susan, but she refused to meet. "That's in the past, Robert," Susan said in a brief phone call. "We both need to look forward." Robert finally found work in a small town far from Oak Ridge, beginning an anonymous and ordinary life. For someone who once enjoyed life in the upper strata of society, this was a cruel reality, but also the result of his choices. 5 years later, the local media published a retrospective report commemorating the 5th anniversary of the exposure of this charity scam. The article detailed the development of the case and the current situation of all those involved. "This case reminds us," the article said, "that even under the brightest appearances can hide deception and dishonesty. But it also shows that integrity and righteousness will eventually be recognized, though the process may be long and painful." When Michael read this article, he didn't feel particular emotional turbulence. That experience had already become a chapter in his life, a page that had been turned. He had learned to coexist with those memories, neither immersing himself in them nor completely forgetting them. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Susan looked at the same article, with eyes full of complex emotions. She had accepted her choices and consequences, trying to find balance in the new reality. She knew some mistakes cannot be fully remedied, some wounds will never heal, but life continues, and each day offers an opportunity to redefine oneself. Emily, as a witness to this complex family story, learned profound lessons about human nature, choices, and consequences. She saw how her father maintained dignity in the face of betrayal, how he chose honesty over convenience. She also saw how her mother lost truly important things due to vanity and desire, and how she began to relearn the meaning of life after losing everything. On a quiet night, Michael sat on the balcony of his apartment, looking at the city lights. The past 5 years had changed many things, but some remained the same. His love for medicine, his concern for patients, and his appreciation for truth and honesty. Despite having experienced betrayal and loss, he still chose to believe in the value and meaning of life. For Michael, the most important lesson wasn't about betrayal or revenge, but about how to maintain one's principles and dignity when facing betrayal. He didn't allow pain to define him, but chose to move forward, though the path was very different from what he had originally imagined. This isn't a perfect ending, without complete reconciliation or thorough revenge. Just real people continuing to live with the consequences of their choices, trying to find meaning and balance. For Michael, Susan, Robert, and Emily, life isn't a simple moral story, but a series of complex choices and unexpected consequences. In this process, each learned important lessons about themselves and others, however painful these lessons were. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more exciting content. We look forward to seeing you in our next story.